All right, so we're talking this time around about Alexander Galloway's book Protocol, and I can understand why you left this one for me to present. It is a challenging piece. I think it's challenging mostly because it's coming at this from a perspective that Galloway himself is explicit about from the beginning, which is this kind of critical cultural approach to understanding how society works through the internet, right? So you can see this in some ways in the people he's citing, people like Manovich, who was instrumental in creating software studies, and some of these folks who have kind of decided to take new technologies as a text. So in the same way you might try to understand, a literary text as in a book or something like that, or a film, they try to analyze and make sense of the ways in which a technology like the internet works. And so in some ways, I think this is kind of a close reading of protocols. As such, I think the lens is really useful, but I also think you can get the forest gets lost a bit in the trees. And so let's talk a little bit about kind of what he argues or what he talks about. I won't talk about his central argument so much, but kind of some of the things that he starts to touch on and how that relates to some of the questions we have. Either in the preface or early on, he kind of situates this as being a question of what happens to societies of control. So he begins by talking about Foucault and biopolitics and this idea of how you had these earlier, the modernity is made up of societies of control, largely through the hegemony of certain understandings of what is acceptable and not acceptable. In other words, we end up governing ourselves through this process. And he sees kind of Deleuze as being the person who is inheriting some of the ideas of Foucault and trying to bring them into the rhizomatic networked version of society that we live in today. And so he's thinking about how these new network technologies that where the technologies that Foucault was interested in were technologies of steam and production, that we in a networked society are likely to have different structures of control. And for Galloway, he's focusing very directly on the protocols, and in this case, the protocols of the internet itself and the layers of protocols on the internet. So we've touched, you've probably encountered Lawrence Lessig's ideas around code as law or law as code, the kind of intersection between code and law. And so this is addressing that, although from a slightly different perspective. He says very explicitly that he's not interested in law or policy directly, except for one chapter in the book that's not part of what we're reading. He's really more interested in these issues of control beyond the technologies of, say, law. I mean, one of the ways you could kind of criticize Lessig's view of this is he's saying that law is code and code is law, but really they're both the same kind of thing, right? They're both technologies of social control. And so he's looking at these protocols as being the preeminent technology of social control. And I think that's that's kind of the central push of what he's trying to do. And I think that's a really valuable idea. I'm not sure we can use it directly as he's presenting it, but I think that idea of breaking down the black box of the internet and the dominant narratives about how the internet works is really essential. He says, that we can't just do away. So he starts out by talking about some of these narratives that we have around the internet, the information superhighway, this idea of the internet being inherently anarchic or distributed. And he says it's not really as distributed as it seems. It's actually maybe decentralized in some ways, a hub and spoke kind of a network where there are multiple centers of control. But he notes that, a lot of this has to do with the materiality of the network itself. So I want to we do tend to black box the internet when we think about it from the social perspective, right? If we're talking about publics online, we don't really think about what it means to be online or what we're talking about when we're talking about the internet. We tend to just kind of black box it. Yeah, we'll talk about platforms and sometimes the rules around platforms, and especially the corporate control of platforms, or in some cases, the intersection of corporate and national, especially policy controls on the internet. So we might talk about those things, but the internet itself, we tend to kind of ignore and just assume it will keep chugging along. It's sort of the ground truth along which all of our social interactions happen. And so when we say that there's something wrong with what's happening with platforms, with the kind of platformization of the internet that we'll continue to talk about on and on and on, that kind of question of the major platforms, and we're talking about things like, Facebook or Twitter, that seems like that's where we need to address these things. As we go, the internet itself is kind of like an onion, layers and layers and layers. And it's designed that way so you can black box the lower layers. I don't need to know, all computing is designed that way, right? I don't need to know what protocols make my RAM work in my computer in order to get online and order something from Amazon. It's good that I can ignore that. So that we continually black box the details and then can build things on top of that. And so he's saying we need to dig into some of these because the protocols that allow for that black boxing are pretty essential to understanding the structures of control. Now he does talk about the kind of the material piece, and I think there is something to thinking about that material piece. We generally do not think at all about the materiality of the internet unless you've visited or had to have gone and worked at, there's in the West Valley in Phoenix, there's a large Apple data center. Actually, Arizona gets a bunch of large data centers. So does Utah, Oklahoma. It tends to be places where you can avoid natural disasters. So Arizona, and although we have heat issues, Arizona, Utah, places like that, have lots of land, have lots of power, and tend not to have too many earthquakes, for example. And so we get a bunch of data centers here. And it's easy to forget that Google, for example, uses more electricity in their data centers than than half the countries of the world. It is a huge consumer of electricity. It takes a lot to make these things run. A lot of people have talked about the kind of raw output of energy required to mine Bitcoin, for example, that a lot of that goes under the surface, but it's just a huge expenditure of energy and of carbon as part of that in both cases, even though, Google has actually done quite a bit to try to make use of renewable resources for their data centers. It's still using mostly carbon-based energy production, oil-based energy production to make the internet work. So, we miss all of that. We miss the data centers out in the middle of nowhere, out at the exurbs or even further out. And we miss, there's often these nondescript large buildings in most metropolitan areas that are designed to switch the actual cables, either fiber optic or copper cables that carry the internet itself. And so we totally ignore that, right? I mean, it feels like, especially with Wi-Fi, like internet is just there. It permeates everything. It's kind of like a magic field, right? It's weird when we can't get access to the internet. But really, it requires just an enormous amount of physical infrastructure for this to work. When I was a graduate student at the University at Washington, we funded. I was part of a group that funded a large part of the computing machinery for the university. And as part of that, we were asked to help fund some of the networking, and we did a site visit to the Gigapop Center in Seattle, and it was a really kind of eye-opening process. We went to this bank building near the campus and took an elevator into the depths of the bank. It was a nondescript sort of bank, and you went to this elevator. Nobody wasn't labeled in any way. Got on the elevator, went down a couple of floors, opened up the door, and there was a guard there with a shotgun. And then you saw kind of the networking that allowed most of the Pacific Northwest to get the internet. If that had gone down, and part of the reason it was, it was about 200 feet above sea level in case there was a large tsunami, because you can't have it be wiped out, right? If that had gone down, it would have, basically blacked out a large portion of the internet in the United States and Canada. And so, once you see that physical centrality, it's really hard to think about the internet as being this, highly resistant, highly resilient physical infrastructure. It does rely on the actual physical technology to make it work. But I'm fine, frankly, with black boxing that piece. I think that we can effectively black box that. And the next layer up is what the internet itself is. A lot of what the internet is built on, a lot of that physical infrastructure is networking, digital networking infrastructure. A lot of it is frankly telephony. It's the telephone system, right? A lot of the internet is built on the back of existing telephone networks. So I'm okay with setting that aside. But, if I ask you what is the internet, define it quickly, is it all the computers connected together? This gets back to the kind of the public thing, right? Is it the spirit of all the computers connected together? And no, I think that fairly, the dictionary definition is probably something like a global network of networks, right? But I think if you really wanted to say what the internet was, you would say it is all of the computers that have all of the people who own the computers who have agreed to abide by a set of protocols. And at the base level, those protocols are TCP/IP, the Transmission Control Protocol, and Internet Protocol. And so these are a set basically of agreements. Any computer can be connected to the internet as long as you adhere to these agreements, these baseline agreements that say, this is how we talk to each other. And then built on top of that are a whole bunch of layers of other protocols that allow the internet to work. And so Galloway talks a little bit about HTML and HTTP, the Hypertext Transmission Protocol, and the markup language for the documents that get sent via that protocol. But there are a whole suite of different protocols at different layers that allow the internet to work. What Galloway doesn't talk about, which is at least in the section we're looking at here, but really not very widely at all, is how those protocols come about. And that, I think, is a really interesting question. Now, these protocols themselves, I think, are a technology, but we don't generally think about agreements as technology. When I say I'm interested in technology, usually you would assume when I say that I mean I'm interested in the physical stuff, right? In computers and video games. I'm interested in the electronics or the way that you build a jet engine. These are the technologies. But the technology comes from the root of techne, of kind of practical knowledge, right? And so I think that the most important technology of the internet is that techne, is that way of controlling how we interact. Now, the question is, how do we come up with those protocols? Well, in the case of TCP/IP, it's arrived at through a group called the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. And the IETF famously has the motto of rough consensus running code. So we do get there, it is kind of, that's as close as we get to kind of an intentional community around creating these protocols. But they actually don't have as many explicit protocols for creating the protocols. The meta protocols are actually pretty anarchic. There isn't kind of a guidebook. There are sort of expectations and formats around how you produce these RFCs, which in the reading you've encountered as requests for comment. These RFCs are really the agreements that make up how the internet works. And you might say, I'm not going to read these technical documents, and you don't have to, but you should try. Like, these are short documents meant to be fairly comprehensible. There are some interesting ones in there. For example, there is a protocol for carrying the internet over pigeons. There's all of these ones that are contributed in order to kind of fit together and make sure everything works together, right? It's a problem-solving exercise. Now, when they produce these, they're not thinking, haha, I'm controlling society. but they are controlling society. It is a mechanism for controlling our interactions. So I'm going to, without this getting too long, I want to kind of back out of this and note that, again, that Galloway isn't talking about publics directly. But that protocol is a method of control. The kinds of protocols we find in, say, TCP/IP allow for people to come to the internet no matter who they are, right? It is an effort at making this system as open as possible. You don't have to get the green light from Apple in order to join the internet or from any other group. You simply have to agree to the ground rules. So some of these protocols are very explicitly ground rules. Now, when you set ground rules, it is a method of control in that it excludes certain behaviors and encourages others. But the design of those ground rules can actually provide, it can be generative as another kind of set of theories around the internet suggests. That is, some systems of protocols allow people to be creative, allow them to interact, allow for consensus, allow for all these things that we actually would like to see, while some can be restrictive. There are fights around protocols, not in necessarily the IETF, although I'm sure those will come along as well. There are fights around protocols and around things like licensing, right? Should HTML and HTTP allow you to do content licensing in certain ways? And that's been an ongoing fight, and there are large moneyed interests who are involved in that. The basic process of peering, of having computers talk to each other on a relatively open and, well, actually at the TCP/IP level, that's kind of flushed, but just below that level, at the actual physical infrastructure, the internet is largely built on these peering agreements between people who own the networks. And some of that has filtered through in the questions around net neutrality, which sadly are probably behind us at this point, that the protections for net neutrality have been undermined to such a degree that it's not clear how well they're protected at all anymore. But it's really hard to get people interested in that because they're like, this is a technical issue. Like, why do I need to call my senator about a technical issue on the internet? Not realizing just how important that is to the ways in which we interact socially at this point. I'm starting to knit these together, and I'm trying to do it as quickly as I can. So I'll wrap up briefly by saying, some of the protocols that Galloway is talking about here have some pretty interesting connections to the protocols that we've encountered in something like a Habermasian public sphere, right? That the public sphere only works when you keep some of the commercial interests at bay. It only works when you have a set of ground rules that say, we accept anyone, you don't have to have a particular status as long as you follow those ground rules for interaction in this space. Publics rely explicitly on those protocols. You cannot have a public without those protocols. And so as we're thinking about this is where I think he gets into the weeds too much. I don't really care specifically about HTML, and I'm not sure how important it is to understand the process of finding those protocols, to understanding the broad social interactions we have online. I do think there's a relationship, but I think it's really easy to get lost in that. So that's at one extreme. The other extreme is to ignore it. And I think that is even more dangerous, right? We have to figure out how these protocols interact with our social structures. And particularly when we're thinking about publics and how publics emerge, that question of protocols and the meta process by which those protocols are arrived at are really essential. So that's why I think it's really useful to kind of engage with the argument that Galloway makes here, is that, I think that understanding the power of the protocol and the growing power of the protocol, that ability to kind of pull yourself away from the details, but have agreements that then undergird a lot of what happens on top of it, that middle space in which the protocols, middle spaces, because they're layers, right? Those middle spaces make a huge impact on how publics work, or more often how they stop working or don't work at all. And so I think being able to say, okay, this is the stuff underneath. We have to understand how this works if we are going to understand productive and useful and politically potent, that's a lot of P's, politically potent publics. To do that, we have to dig under and understand the protocols that allow them to exist or that tend to disrupt them. All right. Thanks very much.